I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Paul Taillie. Dr. Taillie grew up nearby in the Rochester area and went on to earn his undergraduate degree at Cornell University. He was interested in branching out from central New York, so he worked as a seasonal field ornithology technician in all sorts of locations, including the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, the Cascades, Southern Arizona, and the Caribbean lowlands of Costa Rica. Sounds terrible, right? Starting in 2011, he moved to North Carolina, where he earned a Master's of Science and a PhD both in wildlife ecology with a focus on birds. For the past 3 years, he has been a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Florida, where he continued to pursue research aimed at coastal wetlands and the unique wildlife communities they support. Just recently, he joined the faculty of the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as an assistant professor. In addition to continuing and expanding his research program, he is teaching classes related to environmental conservation, data science, and the like. So we're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Taillie with us tonight. Dr. Taillie, take it away.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that introduction sets me up perfectly for a number of things that I was going to start with. But yeah, and so I guess the first thing is that even though I focused on birds, but my research is focused on birds quite a bit. I was always a bit hesitant to call myself an ornithologist because my kind of interests are a bit broader. I think about kind of ecosystems and how they're structured, and kind of species range shifts and communities and biodiversity and all these other things that are, certainly include birds. But I always tell people that a lot of times I usually just focus on birds because they're pretty cheap to study. You just need a clipboard and a pair of binoculars. So really that's how I came to study black rail as well, kind of formally. But when I first, when black rail kind of first came on my radar was when I was working one of those field technician jobs, probably, I don't know, early 2000s at some point. And I was working in California, and another, we were kind of sitting around going through the field guide, talking about birds we could potentially, go find and things like that. And when black rail came up, this person I was working with told me about this place, and I don't really remember the specifics, but told me about this place in California. I think it was in the Bay Area, where it was maybe an impounded wetland, but it was tidal. And when the tide, during particularly high tide events, black rail would get kind of pushed out of the wetland area up onto these dikes that surrounded the wetland. And so they were pretty easy to see. And that was like the spot that a lot of California birders would go to see black rail. The bad news is that a lot of black rails got eaten that way, because when they get pushed, they're really dependent on that really heavy herbaceous vegetation in marshes to hide from predators. And so when they get pushed out of that, that's when they're really susceptible to predation. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But ever since then, and kind of just throughout my life, I guess, I've always been most interested in the animals that are really hard to find. And so, ever since hearing about that, I've always been kind of fascinated with black rail. And so when I started working in thinking about coastal wetlands a lot, I kind of used that opportunity to kind of use it as an excuse to start kind of studying black rail a bit more formally. So I'm going to start by kind of talking about black rail conservation and kind of in their protected status first, kind of drawing heavily on let's see, I think this is my first slide. Let's see. Well, yeah, so drawing heavily on this, shown on the right, this species status assessment report for eastern black rail that is quite recent. I think it was just published in 2021 maybe. But so when I was a doctoral student, There was a report by some folks in Virginia that were doing a lot of surveys for black rail and not finding them in a lot of places where they had been reported in years previous, and that's something that we saw in North Carolina as well. So there started, starting around that time of maybe between 2015 and 2020, there started to be a lot of interest in black rail because it seemed like they were declining pretty quickly. And there are lots of different reasons kind of proposed for that. Things like, that probably the original declines were due to a lot of coastal development in places like, really throughout the kind of southeastern coast, New Jersey, Chesapeake Bay area, all these places. But then in a lot of places, lots of wetland drainage and alteration, drainage for growing trees and stuff like that. We see that a lot in North Carolina. Finally, or not finally, but fire is extremely important in these coastal marshes. Historically, they're very, very flammable, even though they are wet. And so fire is important. There's been lots of studies on other birds, other marsh birds that use these wetland environments that shows that they respond positively to fire. But I'll talk a little bit about how we don't really know if fire is good or bad for black rail. And then finally, we have this kind of emerging threat of sea level rise, which because they rely so heavily on these coastal environments, we're kind of naturally concerned about rising sea levels. And related to that, as I'll kind of talk about at the end, is this threat of predation that it kind of mirrors this scenario that I started with this impounded wetland. So yeah, in terms of their distribution, so again, this is both of these maps are from that status assessment. And so depending on what map you look at, the distribution of eastern black rail can look a little bit different, but generally they're very much a coastal species. They do occur in a few inland places. There's this population in Colorado, which is a little bit different. But for the most part, if you really want to see one, I would probably, I would go to Florida, because it seems like that's the only place where they're not really declining very steeply. But anywhere on the Southeast Atlantic coast or the Gulf Coast with a lot of coastal wetlands is a pretty good bet. Yeah, and so in terms of population estimates, this table from that status assessment kind of illustrates the pretty rapid declines that I mentioned. So just between 2013 and 2016, a lot of these places, the kind of population estimate in terms of the number of breeding pairs is really dropping pretty rapidly. So if you look at Maryland, for instance, a minimum of 200 pairs in 2013 to 15. That's incredible. Or Virginia, same thing, potentially extirpated from the state. North Carolina, pretty much declines range wide, except for maybe Florida. And then weirdly, New Jersey, they appear to be getting more numerous. But I'll talk about how a lot of this is because they're really just a hard species to study, and we don't have a lot of great information. But so there, you kind of get an idea of the best places to go to find them. And so their habitat is they're kind of like a little bit of a Goldilocks species, because they like these wetlands, so they like flooded soils, but they're also very vulnerable to deep water. They're pretty small as far as marsh birds go, and they have pretty short legs. And some marsh birds like Virginia rail and Sora have been documented swimming around when things get deep, but I'm not sure that anyone knows about black rail doing that. But they do, there is pretty widespread consensus that they're pretty sensitive to flooding. So they like these wet areas, but they don't like it to be too deep. And one of the key things is they like this dense herbaceous cover that you kind of see in all of these images. So I think image D is from Honduras, I think. So there are black rail down in Central America, Northern South America, and even down as far as Chile. I'm going to limit this talk to just talking about kind of the Southeast US. But regardless of where you find them, there's this consistent theme of dense herbaceous cover. And then I say not too dense because if it gets, we've seen this with other marsh birds, that if it gets too dense, then it kind of impedes their movement and they're not able to run around the ground as easily as they like, which is important for evading predators. And then finally, a lot of these herbaceous marshes, like I said, are maintained by disturbance, like fire. But again, like I said, I'll kind of talk about this in a little bit. Not too much fire, and I'll talk more about what that might mean.
Melting ice cap is the single biggest contributor to rising global sea levels.
And yeah, so on the left is a wetland that I was working in for my PhD. That actually, kind of while we were doing field work, it burned in a wildfire. And so this is just 2 weeks after that fire burned, and we were able to get back in there. And you can see that this sawgrass is already about calf high, or maybe even knee high. So these marsh plants are very well adapted to fire. Like I said, they've been burning historically for thousands of years, and they have lots of adaptations to deal with that. So what happens here is their roots and their underground rhizomes and things like that stay protected from the fire by the saturated soils. And so once the fire has been extinguished, then they resprout and grow rapidly following fire, and so they're able to cope with that. And then also, kind of like I said, a lot of these marsh birds are similarly adapted to fire. They can cope with it no problem. The lab that I was a part of as a PhD student actually looked at the kind of direct mortality of fire on a number of upland game birds like turkey and northern bobwhite, and we find repeatedly that these species that occur in places that burn regularly are very capable at avoiding fire. They're very capable in kind of running away or flying away, doing whatever they need to do, and then they come back after. But then I was reading this status assessment report and came upon this photo on the right of all of these marsh birds that were killed in a single prescribed fire in Florida back in 1998. Which was really kind of surprising to me, because we see in other systems that birds are very capable at avoiding these fires, especially when they've been encountering them for a long time. So it could be that certain types of fires where they burn in a certain way that they can trap marsh birds or something like that could actually be harmful. And so I'll kind of finish by talking about maybe some other disturbances that we can mimic to kind of avoid this high rate of mortality that fire has the potential to cause. So I mentioned, they occur mostly in these coastal wetlands, and there's lots of concern about rising sea level. So on the top right there, you can see that sea level has risen a fair amount globally. This is from the IPCC report. And then the bottom graph is from a single location, and you can, sea level bounces around quite a bit, even on an annual basis, but it's rising pretty steadily, and it has, that rate of rise has increased. So sea level rise is becoming more and more of a problem all the time. And that would, and so with rising sea level, we're starting to see, so this is work from some folks in the New England area working in salt marshes. This is, that bird pictured there is a salt marsh sparrow, which is also declining pretty rapidly and has a pretty dire conservation status. It's pretty likely that they'll go extinct in the kind of next 20 to 50 years or so. And so there's been a lot of work on this species showing that, so, you know, this diagram on the bottom shows their nest situated in this tall Spartina here. Spartina is one of these coastal marsh grasses. And so they like the tall Spartina because it's better at hiding their nest. So they want a lot of concealment because they don't want their nest to fail. And then they want to put that nest way down in the bottom so that there's more, so that it's more concealed and it's not invisible to kind of aerial predators. The problem is the further down they put that nest, the more likely it is to be flooded by a high tide event or something like that. So they kind of have to put it right there in the middle. And that may sound a lot like kind of the scenario that I'm describing for black rail, where they're sensitive to inundation from tides or storm surge or things like that on the lower end, but then they're sensitive to predation in the uplands on the kind of upland side. And so to kind of bridge into the work that I've been doing, so this is related to my PhD work, where we were looking at, I mean, I was interested broadly in these kind of forests or former forests that we refer to as ghost forests. You can see on the left, there's this really large stand of dead trees that's not caused by fire or any other disturbance that we were aware of. And so we were pretty sure it was related to rising sea level. So we did some work to kind of investigate what was driving the kind of dieback of forests in eastern North Carolina. And we think it's largely a function of increasing salinity. Excuse me. But so, you know, I started to think about, as I was thinking more about ghost forests, and, you know, there, of course, there's lots of concern about losing forests, but I started to recognize that ghost forests were really just one stage in a transition from forest to marsh. And these marshes are really valuable, not just for marsh birds like black rail, but also for, they're super important for coastal fisheries, so supporting larval flounder and blue crab. They're also really important for sequestering carbon, and they also are pretty resilient to rising sea level. They can actually build up and accumulate material from the water and kind of build themselves upward as sea level rises, and they actually do that a little bit better as sea level rises. They can trap more material. So then I started to think about, oh, maybe you know, facilitating the transition from forest to marsh might be good for marsh birds. And we were thinking about the possibility of using fire to do that. And like I said, we had this fire burn through some of our field sites, and you can see it kind of totally consumed all of the woody vegetation. And then we see a lot of this herbaceous sawgrass regrowing really rapidly following fire. And then when I came back a year later, even though, you know, a lot of these forested wetlands that, you know, these kind of forested areas, they also are very adapted to burning and will typically resprout pretty rapidly from their roots. So species like pond pine, and also wax myrtle to some extent, the shrubs, they will all resprout pretty rapidly. But when we came back a year later, we see that it's mostly herbaceous. And so we think again, you know, that the salinity in the soil is kind of stifling that regeneration of woody species, and facilitating that transition to marsh, because these marsh grasses are a little bit better able to tolerate salt than the woody species. So we tried to think, yeah. And so then I started thinking about, you know, there could be benefits for these marsh birds that are of conservation concern. So not just black rail, but other species like seaside sparrow and Virginia rail, king and clapper rail, and least bittern. So then we designed a study to kind of investigate this a little bit more closely. So we basically just went out and counted marsh birds. We used the standardized marsh bird protocol. So on the left is this area of North Carolina. If you're familiar with the Outer Banks, this is just inland from the Outer Banks, this really low-lying peninsula in northeastern North Carolina. And so we sampled basically all the kind of coastal wetlands we could find. And on the right shows a zoomed in picture that shows how we kind of distributed these survey locations across that gradient from forest all the way to marshes out by the shoreline, to kind of see how this community of marsh birds changed as a function of that gradient. We also, so I didn't talk about this too much yet, but black rail are really tough to find. Even if you just want to hear them, they're pretty tough to find. So I could play their call. This is a visual representation of their call. Hopefully you can hear this.
Paul, I think if your sound is not shared also, I don't think we hear it.
Okay.
You can try resharing. If you stop sharing and go to share again, you can select the
share sound. Got it.
Awesome.
Thank you for that. Let's try this again. Did that work? Hopefully.
Yes, it did.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, they have this vocalization, which is pretty unique. But it doesn't necessarily carry quite as far as some of the other marsh birds. So they're really tough to find. So we use these acoustic recorders that we deployed out in these marshes to really extend the duration of time that we, instead, with these other marsh bird counts that we were doing in person, we would just listen for 10 minutes and then we would kind of travel to the next location. But with these acoustic recorders, we have the option to survey for several nights. And that's the other thing about black rail, is they're mostly nocturnal. So a lot of times your best bet to find them is to go out into a, really swampy, mosquito-ridden marsh in the middle of the night where there are alligators and cottonmouths lurking. So it's pretty tough to find them. So we relied pretty heavily on these acoustic monitors, and then we used a machine learning algorithm to kind of go through these hours and hours and hours of recordings, looking for that signature of the black rail vocalization. And so that's why when I said that once I finished my PhD, I still had never. We had a little bit of data on black rail, but I still had never heard or seen one myself because we just detected them on the recorders. Yeah, we got it. All right. So like I said, we tried to distribute those points across this gradient of these shoreline marshes, which are predominantly comprised of this grass called black needle rush or juncus. It's almost 100% juncus. And it contains no woody species and is really far from the forest edge. And then at the upper end of that gradient, we get marshes that look more like this, where we have a little bit more species diversity. It's mostly sawgrass and maybe some upland plants, a little bit of shrubs like wax myrtle and baccharis, some dead tree stumps and things like that. So a little bit more diverse vegetation conditions. And then when we look at how these marsh birds respond, or how their likelihood of occurrence in these marshes changes, we see that for some of these species that we kind of consider low marsh species, like king and clapper rail and seaside sparrow, some of these species that can tolerate a little bit more flooding than black rail, we see that they're way more likely to occur in the low marshes, but that likelihood drops as you get into the kind of closer to the forest edge. And then additionally, you can see a little bit of an effect of the amount of shrubs where seaside sparrows are more likely to occur in marshes that have much less of that woody vegetation. And so what about black rail? Well, I think we only found, I think at 7 points. And so we really didn't have a lot of information to develop these kind of statistical relationships. But anecdotally, I can tell you that that the places where we found them were indeed very close to the forest edge, very much in that transition area. Yeah, with dense cladium, or sorry, sawgrass. And so, yeah, in areas that look like this with a lot of dead trees around. So this is area that is recently converted from forest. And so, yeah, again, we're kind of thinking about, okay, it might be, especially as we experience more and more inundation towards the shoreline, we might need to kind of shift our mentality away from protecting forest loss and more towards facilitating this transition from forest to marsh as sea level rises in order to kind of migrate these marshes landward. Let's see. Yeah, and so originally, with my North Carolina work, we were thinking about doing that with prescribed fire. But in other places, so once I started to work on the Gulf Coast of Florida, that gets a little bit more logistically complicated. It's already logistically complicated because fires in these environments can spread pretty quickly because the grass is so flammable. But so we started to think about some other disturbances that we might mimic. So we know that inundation, so this picture on the top left is a picture from one of our field sites in near the town of Cedar Key in Florida on the Gulf Coast. And here you can see the juncus in the background, but then in the foreground we have more spartina that does better when it's inundated by salt water on a daily basis, and it kind of keeps the juncus at bay and creates these spartina environments. But then there are other disturbances that help to kind of mediate vegetation conditions in these marshes, like herbivory from crabs and snails, and also the deposition of wrack. So wrack is not a term that everyone knows, but it's if you've ever been to a coastal kind of marsh environment, I don't know how that happened, like this, you have probably seen these piles of dead vegetation. These get deposited during a high tide event where the kind of incoming tide pushes all that dead vegetation up into a big pile, and that can also kill the juncus back and then create room for some of these more disturbance dependent species, disturbance dependent plant species that we have shown are important for some other. So we were working with some endangered rodents that use these coastal marshes, and they seem to be more likely to occur in these disturbed areas. And so one project that we have going on right now is we're going to try and manipulate these types of disturbances, so namely herbivory and wrack. So we've kind of set up all of these experimental plots in these huge marshes on the Gulf Coast, and we're just going to go and mimic herbivory by taking a weed whacker and cutting all the marsh vegetation in a plot, and then taking all that cut vegetation and piling it up in a different plot to kill the kind of existing juncus and see if we can create these patches of these disturbance dependent plants that we know are important to some of these coastal species. And so these plots that are kind of close, so in these left two panels, the plots on the bottom are kind of closer. You can't really tell that this is water because it's very shallow and brown looking, but these bottom plots are closer to the water. And then we have these more upland plots that we are kind of looking at how black rail might respond to them as well. And over here on the right, these ones on the left are kind of closer to the shoreline, and these are closer to the forest edge. So we're looking at the potential to create habitat conditions for these endangered rodents, but also for black rail and other marsh birds as well. So some other work that we've been working on in Florida involves a different endangered rodent on the Florida Keys, where we've been using telemetry. So this is one of our field technicians with a radio antenna, and he is tracking some silver rice rats, which is an endangered species in the Keys, that is, much like these other species, is very closely associated with these tidal coastal wetlands. And so we put radio transmitters on these animals and followed them around. And we see that for this species, at least, we see a very pronounced shift between a previous study, some previous work in 2004 and 2021. When we did this, we see that the species has shifted its range upward. When we adjust that for sea level rise in the bottom plot, you can see that these ranges now look pretty close to each other. And so we're kind of inferring that the species is shifting its range up because of rising sea level. And so one thing that I want to do is to use, so this is just an example of some animals that are being tracked with an automated telemetry network. So instead of us having to go out and kind of track these animals with a radio antenna, something that I'm working on right now is to try and set up an automated telemetry network so we can start to kind of track animals in real time and see how they move across the landscape, particularly as a function of inundation. So in North Carolina, we see the water level going up and down a lot, not because of astronomical tides, but what we call meteorological tides or wind tides. So because of the Outer Banks and the limited number of inlets, the water level doesn't change that much in response to the moon cycle, but it is much more driven by winds and how the wind is blown around the estuary. And so we're trying to think about how black rail and other species, especially those that are sensitive to inundation like black rail, how they're kind of pushed around the landscape as a function of rising water. In particular, like I kind of started talking about, how does that inundation expose black rail to increased predation from things like otter or mink, raccoon, coyotes, all these things that might be more common predators in the uplands. And the other thing about the uplands is there's much less of that dense herbaceous cover. So kind of, broadly, I'm thinking about kind of food webs and how they're being affected by rising sea level and climate change and things like that. But in terms of black rail, I think that, the next step on top of, understanding their distribution and how their kind of broad population is changing, we don't really know much yet about the mechanisms driving their decline. And I think that, I guess I feel strongly, or I'm hopeful that predation is one of those, but not hopeful, I guess, but I want that to be the case because I want this study to work. So we're trying to kind of dive into the mechanisms driving these changes in coastal marsh vertebrate communities. And that's not kind of work on the horizon. I think that's about it. But if this type of stuff is interesting, feel free to follow me on Twitter. Of course we can do some questions now. I'm sure we have plenty of time, but also if you have any kind of longer questions, feel free to email me. My email address is right there. And I'll leave you with a nice little picture of a least bittern nest in a coastal wetland.
Awesome. That's a great picture. It's such a great picture. Thanks, Paul. That's so, this is fascinating stuff. It's so interesting to hear about these secretive birds that are so hard to study, that are just, so elusive. So thank you so much for shedding some insight onto this. Yes, I see some applause, some thumbs up emojis across the board. So are there any questions for Paul? Does anybody have any questions? I guess I'll just start with a question. Given the secretive nature of these birds and how, bird watchers so seldom encounter them, sadly, for a lot of us, I think, I would imagine that community science data may not really lend much insight into this, and that really it's got to be this more formal secretive marsh bird survey, like a more formal Secretive marsh bird survey protocol. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not so much. I mean, they both have their strengths, you know. We can only do more kind of formalized surveys. You know, we only have so many resources to do that. And so kind of community science can definitely augment that. You know, we get a lot of observations from, and you know, there's kind of as I was talking about before, many of you joined, we were talking about this kind of black rail working group. So there's a whole network of researchers that have been kind of focusing on black rail for a little bit, that put together that report, and the you know, like eBird observations were part of that. So that can definitely help. But I think the thing that you know, we need to move away from, well, we've kind of done all that we can do with just presence absence sort of observations, and you know, we really need to get a better handle on basic things like abundance, movement, and kind of other sorts of vital rates like reproduction, and you know, how nest success. Like maybe there's a similar sort of thing going on to salt marsh sparrows where you know, maybe it's not predation, but it's nest failure for various reasons. Let's see, I think
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's some questions in the chat. The first one is, how many black rails did you track for your research?
Yeah, so I have never tracked black rails yet. So that the tracking stuff is something that's on the horizon that we're working on. It's a bit ambitious. Because you know, if black rails are hard to find, they're certainly hard to catch. So I have a pretty low bar for that. But like I said, we're kind of looking at, we want to track lots of species and see how these different species maybe differ in their vulnerability to these processes. So yeah, I haven't tracked any yet, but we'll see how that goes. So yeah, Madam Mesquite was on that kind of study area slide. We don't do a ton of work there because it's like a freshwater, a shallow lake sort of situation. It's great for waterfowl and stuff like that, but not so much for kind of herbaceous marshes.
Paul, another question that came to me is, are yellow rails in the same habitat?
So yeah, yellow rail are also really tough to find. I don't think so. They don't breed in. So black rail, I never said this, but so black rail are they're kind of year-round residents in eastern North Carolina, but yellow rail are just there in the winter, and they are extremely hard to find because they don't vocalize at all. But I have seen a couple yellow rail in North Carolina. Some other birders and I were really keen to see a yellow rail, so we got a group of us together and we went out in these marshes and kind of walked in a big line to try and flush rails, and we were able to flush a couple yellow rails. But they usually use the shortest of the grass that you can find out there. So it's a denser, a different type of. So the Spartina that I've been talking about so far is Spartina alterniflora, which is a little bit taller. This is Spartina patens that we usually find yellow rail in, and it's very, very short, just a couple inches high. And man, those yellow rail can hide perfectly in that.
Amazing. Yeah, they're so tiny.
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions for Paul? Somebody has asked in the chat, is there competition between the rail species?
Yeah, I imagine there is. I kind of think about rails a little bit like shorebirds. You know, shorebirds have they have different length, you know, different sizes, different length legs, different shaped bills to kind of access different foods. And so we certainly see that with rail, where you know, things like clapper rail have a big, long, curved bill, whereas like a sora has a little short bill. And so I imagine there is a little bit of niche partitioning there, where you have clapper rail are in deeper water, and and black rail are up in the shallower areas. So there is a little bit of partitioning, but yeah, I mean, we like black rail occur sympatric or like in the same areas as Virginia rail a lot of times. So there's probably some competition there. But again, identify or kind of quantifying the degree of competition can be quite difficult, even for more accessible species. So with marsh birds, it's tough to do kind of rigorous science on things like competition.
Yeah, great.
Comments on the ethics of flushing birds. Yeah, so it's one of those things that it certainly, it causes stress on birds, for sure. I think it's a lot like it should be treated like playing tape for birds and stuff like that. It should be done with some thought, maybe, thinking like, I'm not going to do this in the same place all the time. So we were in a spot where, these were marshes that they're not very hard to access. It's places where birders don't really go. So yeah, there is some ethics to consider there, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Paul, another question just before that was about whether certain species may be better able to cope with the rising sea levels, if we have any sense for this.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, this, I mean, I know this is a group focused on birds, but I can't help but talk about small mammals. So we do see this, we see that this rice rat in the Keys seems to be very able to shift their range. But in addition to that, the reason that we were studying this species in the Keys is because their entire global range is limited to the lower Keys area, which was inundated by about 5 feet of storm surge during Hurricane Irma in 2017. And so there was a lot of concern that maybe this species doesn't even exist anymore because their entire habitat was flooded. But we found them all over the place. And then we see the same thing on the Gulf Coast, following Hurricane Michael, where we see these species somehow, I think a lot, they just retreat into the uplands, or find a tree to hang out in to weather the storm. And hurricanes have been shaping certainly Florida, but the Southeast and Gulf Coasts for many thousands of years. And so I think any species that you find there is going to have at least some ability to cope with things like storm surge, because they have felt it before. So yeah, in terms of playback, so we're using playback for the, that's part of the standardized marsh bird protocol, just because these are very secretive species, and that's one of the kind of these are already hard to find birds, and so we kind of need every tool that we can use to kind of get data on them. And so there's a little bit of a slightly different bar for research, given that our aim with research is for conserving birds and making sure they're around. So I would caution against using playback or flushing birds recreationally. When you're out birding, I very much avoid playback. But we have, I guess it's a different set of rules almost. And then we have there are kind of approval mechanisms in place to make sure that all of our protocols are kind of not doing undue harm to birds.
Great. Well, Paul, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. We haven't heard much about secretive marsh birds in our recent programs, and so this was really special. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for all the questions. Yeah.
Awesome. Happy to have you, and best of luck with everything. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon. And thank you to everybody for coming. Again, be on the lookout for our November program, also virtual.
All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks, Paul. Take care, everyone. Good night.